In the IELTS speaking exam, part 2, you will be asked to describe something. That could be a person, a place, an object, an animal, an experience, or something else. In today's lesson, we're going to look at a cue card that asks you to describe something else. In this case, it's a skill. This may seem difficult, but I will try to explain the whole process clearly and simply so that you can do it for yourself. I will explain the steps in order to answer the cue card. First, analyze the question, then make notes, and finally, answer the question. First of all, we must look at the cue card and read it very carefully. As with the IELTS writing task 2, you cannot simply glance at the question. You need to think about it and make sure that you understand it completely. Sometimes this is pretty straightforward, but other times it requires reading closely and underlining key words. This is the cue card that we will examine today. Describe a skill that takes a long time to learn. You should say what the skill is, why it takes a long time to learn, how and where you can learn it, and explain how you would feel if you learned it. I think this is pretty straightforward to understand, but there is one slightly challenging part. Notice the final line, explain how you would feel if you learned it. What does this mean? If the speaker talks about learning guitar, has he already learned it? No. In this case, we're being asked about something we haven't learned. The words would and if tell us that this cannot be something we already know how to do. It is a small distinction, but an important one. If the question were phrased a little differently, then yes. Perhaps we could have the same question, but with a few subtle changes. Describe a skill that took you a long time to learn. You should say what the skill is, why it took you a long time to learn, how and where you learned it, and explain how you felt when you learned it. In this case, we can see how the question has changed. We are still required to describe a skill. But now we're talking about a skill that we have actually learned in the past. A few small changes to the question now require a very different answer. Okay, let's refresh. What does the question, we're thinking about the first question, require us to do? Describe a skill. Could this be any skill? No. It must be one that takes a long time. We must explain why it takes a long time to learn, give details about how we can learn it and where, and describe how you would feel if you learned it. Once you have analyzed the question, you should make notes. This is important because once you start speaking, you should have something to guide you a little. Even if you are very confident, it can be helpful to be reminded of a useful word or idea. Remember not to write down any more than a word or an idea, though, because you only have 1 minute. That 1 minute should be spent analyzing the question and making notes, so it's not much time. You certainly don't have time to write any full sentences. If you think of any good ideas, a loose structure, or a really great word or phrase, you should write that down. My answer for this question is learning Japanese. This is a language I've always wanted to learn, so it would make a perfect answer for me. Here are my notes. I would write down the phrase Asian language, the word complexity. I would make a note about there being multiple alphabets and characters. I would write down iPad apps and speaking partners. As you can see, I have not written much. I don't feel it's necessary or even helpful to write too much, but a few brief notes can really prove helpful in structuring the speech, in boosting your confidence, and in reminding you of some useful things. In particular, I thought of the word complexity and the phrase multiple alphabets, and thought that they would be good to incorporate into an answer. I also didn't want to forget about iPad apps and speaking partners, as these are both quite important. When it's time to speak, you should speak for between 1 and 2 minutes. The examiner is not allowed to interrupt you at any time, but they will stop you when you reach the 2-minute time limit. If you speak calmly and at a natural pace, it should not be difficult to speak for about 90 seconds, which would be a perfect time. A little warning here, feeling nervous often causes people to speak too quickly. This can make them say everything in less than 1 minute, which then causes them to panic, go off topic, or repeat themselves. You should prepare adequately in order to avoid these mistakes. You must also make sure to begin speaking quickly. Some students hesitate for a long time at the beginning, and this is really not good. If you take 10 or 20 seconds to actually start your answer, you've wasted a lot of time and the examiner will not be impressed. Here is my answer to the above cue card. One skill that takes a really long time to learn is Japanese. This is an old Asian language which is notoriously difficult. Although it has no tones like Chinese or Thai, it is nonetheless renowned for its complexity. It has 3 alphabets which are mixed together according to some really confusing rules to create the Japanese writing system. This makes it far more difficult than most languages. Like any language, you can learn a little Japanese easily, but it takes a long time to get good at it. In fact, becoming fluent at Japanese can take a very long time due to the complexity of the language. It is not just the written language that is tough, but the grammar is hard. Japanese culture is also infused with many cultural rules that require the use of certain honorific forms, meaning that you need to learn a lot of subtle rules in order to speak with people appropriately. These days you can learn Japanese online through helpful videos and audio tutorials. You can download apps for your iPad or find a speaking partner to communicate with on Skype. If I succeeded in learning Japanese, I would feel incredibly proud of myself for learning such a challenging language, and I would also feel excited to plan a trip to Japan, knowing that I could explore more easily with my newfound linguistic skills. In order to answer an IELTS Speaking Part 2 question adequately, you need to read the cue card very carefully to ensure that you understand the question. Next, you need to plan out your answer and write down a few notes to help you. Finally, you should deliver your answer calmly and confidently.